Since we do play the Sicilian, I'd like to highlight what black should play after the c3 Sicilian. The c3 Sicilian you guys are familiar with. It begins after e4, c5, c3. Of course, I can play knight f3 and then play c3, but this doesn't work as well this time because after c3, then we can play knight to f6, and suddenly the d6 pawn kind of stops the e5 move. So this is going to become a little bit awkward. After bishop to d3, knight to c6, bishop c2, bishop g4. D4 doesn't work well because this bishop is pinning the knight, so we can just simply just take, and white's forced to take with the g-pawn. And if white plays something like d3, then we can just go e6. If knight to d2, bishop e7. It will take a while for white to be able to play the move d4. So for example, knight f1, then d5. Black gets d5 in before white gets d4. This is going to be good for black. So there's no debate here. Oh, castling. Therefore, if white wants to play this c3 Sicilian, he'll usually just go with c3 immediately. In here, I recommend the move knight to f6. We're going to look at the main line here for white after e5, knight to d5, and d4. The idea is that if white does play something like g3, you guys should be familiar with those lines because you play that as white as well. After d4, then c takes d4. White has two choices. White can either take on d4 immediately or play knight f3 to use the fact that this d4 pawn is actually pinned to this knight. So you can't take because he takes your knight. Let's look at c takes d4 first. C takes d4. We play d6, immediately countering this center pawn on e5. White can choose to protect it with knight to f3, trying to get his knight on the great square of e5. But then we just continue to put more pressure on this e5 square with knight to c6. He might try attacking us with bishop to c4, attack our knight. But our knight can come back to b6, forcing his bishop to make a decision. He has two options here. He can either play his bishop back to b3, or he can move his bishop to b5. If he moves his bishop to b5, then we can take on e5. If knight takes, then we stop the pin with bishop to d7. If the knight trades on d7, queen takes d7. Knight c3, we simply develop our bishop with e6. If he castles, we play bishop e7. And then he can try to start some queenside attack, or kingside attack with queen to g4. But after kingside castling, a trade here, and bishop to h6, we always have bishop to f6. And there's not much that white can do about this this structure here. Black can play king to h8 next move, and white's bishop will be forced to move. If white plays over here bishop to b3, then black can just simply take on e5. And if white goes d5 here, then simply knight to a5 would work, attacking the bishop here. If knight to c3, we just take the bishop, queen takes, and we play e6 to trade off this d5 pawn. If he takes on e5, we can take on d5. And okay, he can develop with bishop to e3, we go bishop to d6. If he plays this check to try to take advantage of the fact that we have this exposed king, king to f8 is actually pretty safe. And if after knight to f3, then simply we can just go bishop to d7. This position is very, very okay for black. If like queen to b3, we can just play bishop to e6, and then we can always get our king over there to either g7 or f7 sometime later on and move our rook outside. If you don't like this kind of position, you can also try the move d5 here. D5, FD plays knight h4 to stop you from playing your bishop out. You can play e6 to win a tempo, making his knight go back. And then you can develop with bishop e7, castle, and then bishop d7. This is also playable. The other line here for white is to play the move knight to f3. And the idea is not to take the pawn on d4 with the knight, but the idea is just to take the pawn on d4 later on with the pawn. It's very similar to the other line with c takes d4. If knight to c6, then just simply bishop to c4, attacking the knight. When the knight moves away, then once again he can choose bishop b3 or bishop b5. This time, however, he will probably pick bishop to b3. If bishop to b5 in this case, that will kind of backfire a little bit, because in here, d6 has not yet been played, so we can try something like a6. And now the bishop is forced to take on c6, and after d takes c6, this position is not so great, because after c takes d4, our bishop has no problem developing, for example, bishop to g4. And then we can play e6, Our pawns are all in the light squares controlling the lights, all these light squares. So if we trade our bishop off, then we have the ideal situation with a dark square bishop with our pawns and light squares. Therefore, he'll probably play something like bishop to b3. Now, you can probably realize that you can take this pawn now. The problem is if you take this pawn now, then his knight can come out and he has more development. It's okay if you take the pawn. It's not horrible, but I suggest the move d5. It's much more active. It gets your pieces out quicker, and I think it's just not worth taking the pawn in this situation. Once again, white has two choices. White can either take your pawn here, but then your bishop gets out, no problem. This is like the other bishop b3 line, except black is up a tempo. Or he can just simply take on d6, which is the more popular line. If he takes on d6, then we just play queen to d6. And after castling, we can just play bishop to e6. The idea is that we can get this bishop out. Get rid of this bishop that's controlling this long diagonal. Notice that bishop g4 now does not work. If you play bishop g4, you will sadly lose a pawn with takes here, king takes, and knight to g5. Therefore, we play bishop e6 to nullify this bishop's attack on the f7 square. And after knight a3, then we have the move d takes c3 now. If he plays bishop takes e6, that's not something we need to be afraid of. Just take with the queen. If the knight takes on d4, we can take back, his queen takes back, and then we can control the open file with rook d8. Now after queen to h4, we have this interesting line of queen to e2. The idea is that we're actually threatening rook to d1 with some dire threats. Now there's a couple ways that white might choose to solve this. White can either play knight to d2, or then we just simply ignore the sacrifice on d2. We don't want to take. It's just slower. We just play e6. We need to get our bishop out first, and after queen g3, h5, knight f3 and h4, the queen will come to c7, and then we can defend the pawn with queen a6. The idea is that we actually have some counterplay on the king side as well. And after, for example, bishop g5, f6, and bishop takes h4, we can play our knight to d5. If queen to g3, then we simply have the move g5. If he doesn't go back to g3, then his queen's actually trapped. If he plays bishop to e3, then he's giving up the pawn on b2. Queen takes b2 is a good idea here now. And he needs to play knight to d2 to save his rook, but now he's just losing two pieces for a rook as well. And here, as long as you play carefully, you should be able to survive the situation. Chances are white will actually delay recapturing the rook. He'll first win a tempo on your queen with rook to b1. But you can take another pawn here, which seems very, very risky. But this position is actually totally playable. If he takes your rook now, for example, then you can plays rook to d1. You move your queen to a5. Notice you want to control these squares on this diagonal because you don't want him to check here, which would cause mate. For example, if you played carelessly and you went, say, like queen to, or not queen to e2, let's say you played queen to c3, then after takes here, this would be losing because after takes, it would be checkmate in a couple moves. So queen to a5 is the correct move. We need to control the a4 square, very important. He might come to attack our pawn on b7, but that's okay. We can always play f6 and put our king onto f7 ourselves. If he takes here, then we can play g5, get our bishop over here, put our king over here. And even though this looks weird, we're up a lot of material. So as long as we can survive, then we will win this game. So if he plays rook to c1, we can just play simply king to f7. I think black should be fine here. The king is doing okay on f7, and as long as he can get the kingside pieces developed, the extra material should suffice to win. If he doesn't take on e6 here, he might play knight to a3. But if knight to a3, then we can now take the pawn safely. If queen to e2, he's actually sacrificing two pawns now. But once again, we don't want to take both pawns here. We want to trade material here. Oops, knight to b5, queen to b8. And now we just want to play e5. We want to get our pieces out. That's our main priority. If he takes on c3, then we play bishop to e7. The idea is that we need to castle as soon as possible. If he goes bishop to g5, then we need to avoid this trade here because we don't want his knight onto g5. So we just play f6. His bishop will come back, and then we can play knight to d5 here. Knight to d5, we're attacking his bishop. and we are solving the problem with our knight on b6. Here we'll plan on castling soon, and for example, if you play c4, just simply knight takes, queen takes, and castles. Black is doing fine here. He has the bishop, though the bishop is a little bit locked in, but overall he's up a pawn, so I don't see that this position, I don't see that white has enough compensation here, and I think black should be doing just great. So we play knight to f6 in this position, forcing him to play e5 in the c3 Sicilian, and after knight d5, we just need to be aware of our strategy against the bishop c4 lines. If bishop c4, we play our knight back to c6, and we try to play d5 to get a central control. Though sometimes we might need to take on e5, depending on if we play d6 first. In general, black will get an open position that's very sharp, so you need to have some knowledge of the opening in this system. But I think if you have the knowledge, then the c3 Sicilian should be very, very good for white, or for black in this situation.